what we'll do now is we'll shift gears and kind of open it up a little bit more broadly to I know Brad's here and Miguel's here. So if you guys want to pop back on, and I thought what we would do is spend a little bit of time talking about some of what was presented today, and I also have some sort of questions. Before we get there, though, Brad, there were a few questions for you that we didn't get a chance to get to before the bio break. So I just wanted to kind of raise those one more time before we get started to give you an opportunity to respond. One of the questions first off was, so for those who are just joining, Brad presented some research he's done on how consumers respond to different types of date labeling. And one of the findings was that if we shift to a regime in which there's maybe a smarter date label or a date label with different type of language, it could actually change consumer purchase behavior in a way that could positively influence food waste and loss reduction strategies. So one of the questions that was raised was, do you have any thoughts on, instead of thinking about best by or use by, maybe like a production or a prepared on date, rather than how long you can use it for, when was it made? And I think we see this I've seen this with some products, certainly with products that are not necessarily shelf stable. Do you have any thoughts on that, just at a high level?
Yeah, no, that's a really good thought. And we spent a lot of time thinking about these 10 different treatments that we did include in that particular experiment with all the different date labels. And at one point we thought about having I think for some food products, either here or somewhere else in the world, they actually had this, they had this sort of two-part, they had a use by date and then a best by date. So they were trying to communicate that there's a food quality date and that there might be a food safety type of date. And at one point we thought about including that as a treatment because we thought that could, consumers might react to that kind of information. I suppose this idea of the prepared on is another way of sort of signaling some food quality. I think with sometimes deli meat, sometimes even in the United States will sometimes show the date that it was packaged on or it was prepared on, and then it'll also have some sort of a use by date. I think that's a really interesting. Yeah, I think if I was to do this over again, I might have included that treatment. But to be honest, I think we started off saying we wanted to have 4 treatments, and then someone talked me into 6, and then by the time we got to 10, we had to sort of pull the plug, and it was getting out of hand. But reflecting and now hearing, whoever, I can't see who made this comment, that's a really good idea. Seeing that it's coming from this audience makes me feel that I should. So, and I'm probably not done with this type of work. We'll probably go back and do some more. So I like that idea. So thank you, whoever had that idea.
That was, I think I've got it here. It was Timothy Young. So one other question that was raised during your presentation was just from a policy standpoint, the stuff what you're finding. Autumn asked if you've pitched any of these findings to any government, any policymakers really that are essentially entertaining the Date Labeling Act. What were you at? Do you see this actually maybe being something that a policymaker might be interested in learning about, or where are you at with that?
Yeah, so that's also so that's our end goal. That's where I'm sort of feeling out these ideas, presenting it to some academic and industry audiences, just to, I don't know, their industry audiences, maybe more than academic audiences, are just good at sort of poking holes and just making sure that I'm communicating the story and the analysis correctly. But I think that's sort of our next step. I'm not sure, if we'll be able to, get on the radar of, Pingree's office. They're the ones that have been thinking about this for the longest time. But that would be sort of our end goal. And I think one reason I just want to make sure I have it done correctly is because one of our findings, I think, is going to be, and I think this is policy relevant and interesting, and potentially important, is that our results are suggesting that this language, that the preferred language in the bill is to use this phrase "best if used by," and our findings aren't showing that that's actually, that might actually, depending on what's the other option, that might increase food waste among certain food consumers for certain food products. So it's not clear that that's actually, a sound policy adjustment. I don't know. It could be partly just words and how people interpret words, but the big difference between using the language "best by" and "best if used by" is that "best if used by" includes the word "use," and I think some people just associate that word "use." It has more of a connection to food safety, whereas if you just simply say "best by," it's more about food quality. And so I think that is something to keep in mind.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's our end goal, is to try to make some sort of policy recommendation to people who are making these decisions.
Got it. Okay, well, I think those were the two main questions I saw pop up. Oh, actually, Autumn's got another question. So she says, do you think the addition of consumer education in the act would help? So educating consumers about what these date labels actually mean as part of the policymaking process.
Yeah, no, I think the consumer education piece is, it's tricky too. But I agree that, yeah, if we could somehow communicate what these labels mean. Currently, they don't really mean anything. People, just use them, for food manufacturers can, even within a category, you'll see different date labels. Different yogurt manufacturers use different date labels, partly because there are no rules. There are some rules for fluid milk and for, infant formula, but other than that, there's really no rules about what language you use on these. And so I think education could go, but it would have to be, you'd have to have a captive audience that's sort of listening and wanting to hear this information. But I agree, that could be a big part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I have some research in a different area around food labeling, but one of the things that we've found is that the process of making a policy itself, just the information environment that it creates, that even without a change in the policy, that actual policy making process, that rulemaking process, that in and of itself actually can change consumer behavior, which is kind of an interesting idea when you think about how the mechanism by which legislation actually changes consumer behavior. It's not just the actual implementation of something, it's the whole process of, you're reading about it in the newspaper, you're reading about it on the internet, whatever it may be. Those things actually raise awareness in a way too, and have sort of an indirect effect. So I suspect you would see similar things here with something like this. So what I want to do, though, I think I'll shift gears to a little bit more of a broader conversation. The title of the roundtable is Implementation of Food Waste and Loss Reduction Strategies and How to Avoid Unintended Consequences. And I think, that's something I want to spend a little bit of time talking with you about, this notion of unintended consequences, because that's sort of I guess I kind of consider that to be the one of the big or sort of the primary wheelhouse of economics is this idea of law of unintended consequences. So I think it's worth discussing to some extent. In environmental economics, we hear about this idea of unintended consequences when we implement changes in policy. I think there's a really classic example, which obviously Brad and Miguel, you both know about, but I'll share with the rest of the audience, this idea of the rebound effect. So imagine that the government makes a policy to increase the fuel efficiency of cars. The idea being that we'll reduce our use of fuel. Well, if you make more fuel efficient cars, one unintended consequence might be that consumers choose to drive more, because you've just now made the cost of driving, the cost of traveling less expensive. Or on the other hand, you might see similar things happen on the supply side where if you try to pass a law to reduce carbon emissions, if that law is going to go into effect 5 years from now, you might see firms respond in the short term by actually, sort of increasing their emissions in the short term to kind of get done what they can get done before the law gets passed. So there's all of these unintended consequences that we observe in policymaking, and I like to think about food waste in that context as well, because I suspect that there may be some unintended consequences of food waste and loss reduction strategies that we need to be aware of at each stage of the supply chain. And I just wanted to kind of open it up. If you have thoughts, maybe Miguel, I maybe can start with Miguel. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm curious, like maybe at the farm level, when we talk about food waste reduction strategies, is there anything we should be as industry folks, as policymakers, or that we should be thinking about as secondary effects that we want to make sure we avoid when we think about food loss and waste reduction strategies?
Yeah, and let me thank you, Aaron, and let me answer. You try to provide an answer not at the farm level, but at
okay, sure.
Supply chain, because so there are two things. If you think about business opportunities and you think in economic terms is different. So what I have seen in my interaction with industry and in the work in the work that we have done, not only at the farm level, is that there is strong interest in creating business platforms to avoid to move food that is in the commercial supply chain and to redirect it to other type of supply chain that goes to people in need that are never going to buy, are less likely to buy in the commercial supply chain. You're not in the supermarket, but maybe in other outlets that are not competing. So I don't see that as if supply chains operated in isolation and you have your own market and it's only like that, the commercials, then I will say yes. So, if you reduce food waste, of course, food prices are going to go down because there is going to be more supply. And then probably somebody along the supply chain is going to lose. Consumers certainly are going to win if you have less level of food losses. But in what I have seen is that just on the contrary, at each level of the supply chain, retailing, manufacturing, there are new businesses. And by the way, these are led by very young people, tech savvy, based on information technology, basically purchasing food or getting food from the commercial sector and repurposing it through food banks or through other different types of businesses. An example of that is the food dollars. A food dollar store, which, by the way, food dollars have more than twice as retail outlets and Walmart in the US. I think it's 3 times. They have a huge number of outlets.
This is like the dollar stores?
The dollar stores.
Yeah.
Excuse me, dollar stores are increasing. Now you go to any dollar store and more than half of the revenues of store are food and fresh foods, frozen foods, wide assortment. So those are these type of businesses that are repurposing food. And they don't really compete in the retail market a lot. Or if you think about the food bank supply chain. So I don't think there is competition. I think that there is just benefits for society. I think if we had only 2 Walmarts and 2 identical supply chains competing for the same markets, yes, you will have a detrimental effect maybe on the profits of somebody in the supply chain. It may be farmers or packers, shippers, manufacturers, retailers, and the consumer may be winning, but I don't think that's the case. Yeah. Because food goes to the table for so many different channels that they don't necessarily compete with each other.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I fully appreciated how the role of dollar stores. I've seen a lot of buzz around them in terms of their impact, but I didn't fully appreciate just how significant that might be.
Yeah.
Brad, any thoughts on sort of what you may, I mean, at any level of the supply chain or even at the consumer level that you think, if you're going to sort of identify one thing we want to, as we start to think about solutions to food waste and loss, is there any sort of unintended consequence that you think is really sort of top of mind that we should be thinking about, particularly as new technologies developed or new products are developed?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I think this is something that, I think policymakers want to be really sort of cognizant of these unintended or these potential unintended consequences as they, right? Because fixing the food waste problem is a good thing, but we want to make sure that we don't create new problems by fixing the food waste problem, right? And so a couple of the obvious things, if you have less food waste, then I think, and David just also hinted at this, if you have less food waste, I think one of two things is going to happen, right? People are either going to consume more food. That's one way to have less food waste, right? Or people are going to purchase less food. I think those are sort of the two sort of outcomes of less food waste. And if you have less food waste because people are eating more food, then you got to worry, is that sort of creating new problems in human health and diet composition? What are those foods that they're now consuming that they otherwise weren't, as a solution to food waste? But on the other hand, I think it's much more likely that if we have less food waste, then some households will continue eating at their current levels and they'll just purchase less foods. And this will have repercussions in food markets, for food retailers, food manufacturers. It'll affect food prices. And then because food prices will adjust, then, that will also maybe create new decisions that food consumers will make because they'll be faced with a new suite of prices. So I think those are sort of, you want to think through those two lines, not you, Aaron, but I mean, collectively, we want to think about sort of these unintended consequences of less food waste. I think the other thing, and I've just been sort of brought into this recently, there's a group of colleagues in Europe that are starting a study, and that study, it's about food waste, and it's motivated by the food insecurity angle. And we always think that, we have all this food waste, we have, somewhere between about 15% of households in the United States are foods insecure in some capacity. And can't we think about ways to reduce food waste and improve diet quality for some of the food insecure households in the United States? And I think there's a lot of sort of unintended consequences that you need to think about in that. And I think Miguel's probably able to speak to some of those, how those supply chains could work and might work more or less efficiently. But in France in particular, what they're finding is that there's food donations that are going to the traditional food banks and other users that can redistribute food that otherwise might be wasted to food insecure households in France. But at the same time, there's these new apps that are being used, and they're being used more and more widely, where food retailers are packaging some of their food that's about to expire or is no longer maybe as new food comes in. And so now they have this choice whether this extra food, the surplus food, could go to food banks, or they could try to discount it heavily and sell it through some of these popular apps. There's one, TGTG, I think it's Too Good to Go. There's another one called Phoenix.
Yeah.
And there's some preliminary evidence that originally the hope was that the Phoenix and the Too Good to Go apps were going to help, direct these food packages from food retailers to food insecure households, and that it would be a way to reduce the food waste problem, help the food insecure population in France. But it turns out, as they're starting to collect data on the users of these apps, it turns out it's it's not food insecure households. The majority of the users of these apps are not food insecure. It's people like many of us that are using these apps and are buying this food. And so there's this concern of this unintended consequence that the rise of the popularity of these apps may be, in fact, reducing the amount of food that is going to the traditional food bank sources. And so I think this is another illustration of a unintended consequence of it's a solution. This is more of a market-based solution to food waste that might be redirecting food away from these traditional sources and creating, more stress in that community.
That's an interesting observation, and I think in the U.S. there's a company called Imperfect Foods as well that's doing similar stuff where you can essentially a two-sided marketplace to purchase food. And it hadn't occurred to me though that might come at the expense of operations that are designed to target disadvantaged populations. But I think that's an important consideration, particularly if we're thinking about food waste as a potential way to relieve the stress of food insecurity as the population grows. Which was actually another question I was asking. But before I get to that, there is one thing I wanted to ask. Is when we talk about unintended consequences and we talk about we're talking about it rather broadly, and it occurs to me that there may be different consequences based on whether or not the food waste and loss reduction strategies we choose. So yesterday there was a whole lot of discussion around methods for prevention, which might involve food technological solutions, product development, as well as methods around recycling and upcycling, where it's something that sort of occurs outside of the traditional supply chain, outside of traditional product development. Do either of you have any thoughts on whether sort of these within or these, I'll call them internal technological developments that prevent food waste are better or worse than, say, a solution that happens after the fact, like recycling or upcycling of food waste or diverting food waste streams? In terms of unintended consequences, do you see one versus the other being more, one versus the other solution being more or better suited to preventing unintended consequences? I know that's a tough question to answer, but any thoughts on that?
Just very briefly, I think it depends on the product category, the perishability of the product. But in general, if you think about technologies that help you make your processes more efficient, transportation or processing or whatever along the supply chain, that should result in a more efficient supply chain, smaller price spreads, meaning the difference between farm prices and retail prices and benefits. I would say that perhaps the unintended consequence is that there will be incentives to buy less from the farmers, who are typically, from the suppliers in general. If you have lower waste, you will be smarter in purchasing your input for production or for whatever your business is, in this case, food. And if there is there is this idea that farmers are always the weak end of the supply chain because there are many and they are not, they are not as big as buyers, then there may be some effects on the prices received and the amount of the prices and the purchases from farmers, but that's hypothetical.
Yeah. Thanks. So
yeah, I think
go ahead, Brad. Yeah.
Oh, Aaron, I'm just going to follow up. I think that's a good, yeah, I think I agree with Miguel. I think it's first and foremost, it depends on the category, because each of these food categories, you know, the rate of waste is different. You know, sort of the social and the environmental impacts of the waste is different. But I think one way to think about this, whether it's unintended consequences or whether it's just, you know, the first best versus the second best alternatives to thinking about strategies to reduce food waste. I think, you know, there's this one diagram that the EPA shows. I think it's the EPA that shows this sort of upside down triangle, and they show how basically they're trying to communicate that the farther the food is from the farm, the more resources and the more energy, the more human capital, the more marketing efforts that are put into these foods, the further it comes away from the farm. And so, you know, as it goes from the farm to the food manufacturers, to the retailers, to the consumers, and then beyond the consumers, it's just accumulating sort of, you know, economic, social, environmental costs. And I think the punchline from this upside down triangle is that you know, the solutions that could have the most impact with those, you know, those solutions that could come closer to the farm. Those would be the solutions that would solve food waste, but the solutions that have the greatest economic impact are those that are further away from the point of production. I wish I had that at my fingertips, because it's a nice sort of picture that kind of addresses this question.
Yeah, I know. I think someone yesterday in one of the roundtables, I think it might have been Pete Pearson at World Wildlife Fund, maybe mentioned something very similar to what you just said. So I think there's definitely something there. Yeah. Okay, so one of the questions, I'm going to shift gears for a little bit here. One of the questions I was originally thinking about after Harry DeGorder presented sort of the overarching economics of food waste, one of his slides that really stood out, and I suspect for those of you who were here on the call this morning, you might, or this earlier today, you might have struck you as well, is he said that food waste is rational, which is a really, for economists, you know, we take that for granted, but for someone who's a non-economist, you see that and it sounds really odd. And I think, you know, the way I wanted to kind of just discuss that for a second and get your take on it. But the basic idea of what he means is that, you know, in a market-based economy, we're all maximizing some, you know, we're either consumers are maximizing utility, firms are maximizing profit. So if there's food waste, if there's some food being thrown away or wasted or lost, we, in a market-based economy, as economists, we say, well, there's a reason for that. It's currently in the current set of market conditions with the current set of constraints that these firms are under. This is the most profitable way they know how to do business, or this is the most profitable way they're able to do business given the current market constraints. It's the optimal level. So I think, you know, one of the questions I was, and I think Vishal Gaur's presentation on CPG retailing kind of shed light on this as well. And I asked him about this earlier. He unfortunately wasn't able to join the roundtable due to a conflict, but I did ask him about this. I said, if that's optimal, are firms leaving money on the table, or what's going on? How do we shift that optimum? How do we shift that so that this level of food waste is no longer the optimal solution? And he said that, you know, so I just wanted to kind of recount what he said and then maybe have you two reflect on it. He said that he agreed that firms are optimizing and that we currently operate in this market at an optimal level of food waste. But the thing to consider here is that's within the current constraints. So when we have a new technology that's developed, whether it's smart packaging, traceability, whatever it may be, that essentially changes the set of constraints. It alleviates the constraints and makes new data visible. And then firms have an opportunity to improve those solutions and reach a new optimum that presumably would have lower food waste and higher profit. And the same thing can happen when we have a better alignment of incentives across supply chain actors. So I guess my question I was going to pose to you, or maybe just put it out to both of you, is what do you see as maybe one of the most, if we're going to try to shift this optimum in our current market-based economy, What are some measures you see that might be most important in trying to do that, at least at the firm level or at the food processor level? I know that's a big question to answer, but does that strike you as as something we should be talking about? And I guess I'll add one follow-up to that. And the follow-up question to that is, where does that innovation come from? So if it is a technological innovation, so yesterday we heard from a lot of folks that in food science and technology that are developing new packaging, developing these things. But the question then becomes, well, how do we implement these things when the marketers and the accountants at the firms that we're trying to pitch these to perceive them as being too expensive or lacking consumer acceptance? Where do you see that innovation coming from if we are going to try to sort of move that optimum in a discrete way with these types of developments?
Right, you can go first.
I saved the hardest question for last.
Yeah, so this is a tough question. But I think it is really important to spend some time thinking about and I think this is usually this discussion kind of goes down this path towards, is there some regulation that we could think of that might encourage, in this case, food manufacturers to do the right thing or to move in a direction where there is less food waste. But honestly, I know you've pitched this question as more of a food manufacturing perspective, but I also think of this question, the flip side of this question is, it's consumers are the ones that are wasting the largest share of food, right? The percentage of food that happens at retailers is reasonably small. The amount of food that's lost on grain farms in America is pretty small. There is a lot of food loss at fruit and vegetable farms in the United States, but the lion's share of food waste happens by consumers. And I think you might also sort of flip your question and think about, you and I as consumers, like David and like Harry said, I think it's just our time has become so valuable, the price of our time outweighs the price of food. And so, we as consumers are the ones making these decisions. We're the ones purchasing too much food, purchasing more food than we need because, if I have to go back to the store on Tuesday night because I didn't perfectly plan my pantry requirements for the week, and if I have to make another trip back on Tuesday night when I've already got a bunch of other things planned to do, that costs me more than spending $10 extra on Saturday when I was already at the grocery store, bought too much food. I think this is I think this story is clear through the discussion today. And I think, honestly, if there is any regulatory measures, it might be more effective. This is sort of a broad question for economists as to sort of the optimal placement of regulations to address food waste. And, where should these regulations fall along the supply chain? Should it be, food manufacturers or food retailers or final consumers? And so I think it's a question where, it's not only a question as to what's the optimal solution for food manufacturers. It's actually a larger question, thinking about the whole spectrum, the whole supply chain, and where might these tools or these incentive programs, or whether it's, a three-part program that includes incentives along the supply chain. But I think a lot of this, I think there's some clever tools and ideas that could happen at the household level that could go a long, long way to reducing food waste, in addition to measures at the farm level and at food manufacturing level as well. I think before I get into any more of the weeds, I might just let Miguel, he looks like he's nodding and has something he wants to add too.
No, very briefly, is that sometimes in those discussions of a new technology or new packaging, say, for example, to reduce food waste. So it's costly, and accountants in businesses, responsible for the financial health of the company worry about that. But sometimes we forget that. Remember that companies compete not only on prices, on quality of the product, but also on some attributes. So if you consider the most successful supermarkets or food manufacturers, they give a priority to sustainability initiatives, even though and food waste is one of those. So we sometimes forget that efforts to reduce food waste or in other ways being more sustainable is awarded in the market, not necessarily always in terms of high prices, but on choices, on gaining market share. So in a way, I think in my interactions on this very topic is that we in the supply chain sometimes focus a little bit too much on the cost aspect of new technologies to reduce food waste in this case in particular, or any other initiative, but not on how do we capture value, customer loyalty, and all these the newer generations. It's a report by forgot the name of the company, or follow what's important for younger generations in terms of where do they want to work and what companies should be doing, and environmental efforts to become more sustainable are top than others. They don't believe that the food industry in particular is doing enough of that, of those efforts. So I think those will be rewarded again in the market, not necessarily higher prices, but increased market share or preferences of the consumers.
That's a really, I mean, that actually that resonates a lot with what I was thinking, and it sounds like, at least to some extent, what you were saying, Miguel, is that we need to be thinking more as decision makers in businesses. You need to be thinking much more broadly than your typical, costs and margins and prices. I mean, there's so much more to, especially now, as you mentioned, with the push towards sort of mission-driven enterprises. There's a lot more to consider than just prices. There's a lot more to consider than just costs. And if you think of it, really depends on it. Kind of to some extent, it depends on what your time horizon is, right? I mean, are you thinking about when you say the long-term health of the company? Are we talking about 5 years? Are we talking about 10 years? Are we talking about a generation? And depending on how you think about that or how you solve that problem, the answer could be potentially very different. So to some extent, if I'm thinking about this, if I put my business cap on for a second, I think making sure that the decision makers in companies are aligned with whatever the long-term values of the company are, or the long-term strategies of the company are, is going to be very important, so that prices and costs maybe aren't prioritized more than they should be, and maybe some of these other things like talent acquisition are put into the mix. And I think we're seeing that. I mean, we're certainly seeing that on Wall Street with the increasing relevance and importance of ESG investing, and these new funds that are being developed exclusively to target sustainability-oriented companies. I think we are seeing that shift across a number of different aspects of society. So, Brad, did you want to add anything? Or I could potentially shift gears, but I don't want to dilute the conversation.
No, I just no. I think I agree with what Miguel says. I think there are. I think it's the technology, the packaging, the opportunity for, there's been some discussion about, the opportunity for consumers to have more say in package sizes, or have more discrete units rather than, thinking in a more traditional way. I think these are some sort of market-based packaging strategies that might lend themselves to, greater profits, greater flexibility, and potentially less food waste. But I think it's part of it is just, I just come back to, and this is sort of an extension of, I think Autumn had some good thoughts earlier. But part of this is part of the education and part of the communication strategy as well. And, when you're thinking about communicating, the consequences of food waste, really, there's a story about the environment, there's a story about food insecurity, and there's a story about sort of the cost to the household. And I think sort of thinking about those and thinking about which consumer segments care more or less about those three stories, I think is another strategy. I think, food manufacturers are always thinking about the different segments. They're selling the same product to many different people who have different views on sustainability, come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, who put more or less thought into food purchases. And so I think, just making sure you have some stratified approach to, helping each of these groups think about, the impact of food waste, whether it's reasons related to the environment, reasons related to food insecurity, or for a lot of people, just reasons related to their wallet.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think I'm glad you called me out on the sort of pitching this as a firm problem or as a manufacturer problem, when in fact there's, we need to also understand the role of consumers and understand their part to play in food waste. And I think part of the reason I fell into, and I did fall into that trap a bit, and I actually want to, I was thinking a bit about that. And I think part of the reason is, I think, it's much easier for us to discuss strategies for optimizing at the farm level or at the processor level, at the retail level, because we understand, there's a clear set of incentives that we can manipulate or change. I don't mean manipulate in a negative way, but a clear set of incentives for a firm to make money. We know how to affect those and shift those and optimize those. Consumers it's a much more challenging thing to address, and it's no surprise in that sense that, at least in the US, that the largest, the lion's share of food waste does come at the consumer level, because it's a much harder problem to solve, trying to essentially change consumer preferences or change consumer behavior. And I think so one of the thoughts we discussed earlier was this idea of shifting the burden up the supply chain to other actors or other nodes in the supply chain, and I think the reason we argue for that is largely because it's easier, right? Like, we see it as sort of an easier solution than trying to affect change in consumers. But you guys both raised very good points about the fact that preferences they are evolving, and I think we have the tools to address that, or we have the tools to understand that. It's just a matter of being a little more dedicated to focusing on that aspect of the value chain. So we are coming up on 3:30, which I think was the slated time for our completion. So I'll just leave, one more, I'll leave it open just for a minute. If you guys have any last minute comments, or if anyone in the chat wanted to add anything, we'll leave it up, just toss it out there for a minute. And if not, we'll start to wrap up. Going once. Brad?
I would just invite anyone, from this very keen audience to reach out to me and let me know what you're thinking. And if you have some ideas that you feel may require some research, I do have some flexibility to consider a range of issues related to date labels, but perhaps a little bit bigger than that within some of the current funding that I have. So I'm always kind of curious to get feedback from folks inside the university, but also outside the university. So don't be shy if you have some ideas. Chances are they're good ideas.
Great. All right. Then with that, I will. I think we can go ahead and start to wrap up. I just want to thank Brad Rickard and Miguel Gomez for participating in the roundtable. We really appreciate your insight here. I think it's given us quite a bit to think about, and it's really refreshing. I mean, it's amazing to see how many people certainly across Cornell and across industry are thinking about this problem. I mean, this is one of these classic wicked problems that's that really requires a systems approach. It's not just going to be social scientists. It's not just going to be food scientists. It's not just going to be folks working at the production level. It's going to be a combination of all of us working together with industry to come up with solutions that are going to work across the supply chain.